Welcome. I'd like to talk to you today about jobs and opportunities in pathology. There's not a lot of information in this arena, and it often is somewhat hard to obtain because most people have had no experiences in other areas of either academic or private labs in which to contribute knowledge. I think it's important to remember that um, no matter what choice you make, the grass is brown on all sides, right? There's no right or wrong answer. It's just simply what is right for you and your family. Having said that, I will say that by knowing some of the pitfalls, the pluses and minuses of the various job options, one can definitely avoid the sharks that lurk beneath the waters. And I hope to also educate you a little bit on that today as well. Let me start by telling you a little bit about myself and why I believe I'm uniquely qualified to talk about this topic. So I've been in both a traditional academic setting and a full-fledged private practice. Uh, the opportunities I had in academics allowed me to excel at publishing and teaching, and I even obtained tenure, which is not often offered for people on the clinical track, but it was offered at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, back when I obtained it. I've also been a part of a private practice. I've owned a lab, co-owned a lab with other colleagues. I've dealt with the business aspect of it. I've helped recruit pathologists in both arenas, and now I exist at the Cleveland Clinic somewhat in what is called a hybrid model. So I can tell you a lot about both these types of practices. And as I said before, don't think of these as better or worse or right or wrong. Think of these in terms of what you want for your life and how this may benefit you or your family or significant other. Okay, so what kind of jobs exist in pathology? So I've divided these broadly into university-based employment, which some people refer to as academics. This shouldn't imply that you have to be university employed to pursue academic endeavors. I wrote papers and book chapters while I was in private practice, but generally speaking, the way most of us think about employment, usually when we use the term academics, we equate that with university-based employment. There also is private, like private national lab employment, where this could be, for example, LabCorp or Quest. People can be employed by the government, for example, at a VA hospital. There's private practice employment. You could be employed in a hospital setting or by a freestanding private practice. And of course, there's partnership or self-employed type of practices. So let's first dispel some myths that still persist in the pathology environment. One is university-based and employed pathologists are not well paid. We're going to talk very specifically about salary shortly, but this is not the case. As physicians, we are very well compensated. Secondly, you must do researches to succeed in academics. This is especially today, this is not true at all. I think over the last 25 to 30 years, most university-based settings have realized that they cannot just employ people who are outstanding at obtaining grants and doing research. They need good clinicians as well. And for that reason, there now exist in many institutions clinical tracks and pure research tracks. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but in most situations I'm aware, tenure is not a part of most clinical track type settings. Thirdly, private practice is only interested in money, and this is absolutely false. I've known fantastic physicians in the private practice arena that always have the best interest of the patient at heart. That being said, you have to remember that medicine as a whole is a business, and that includes university-based practices as well as the private industry. So money is part of that business, but it shouldn't be the driving motivation behind it. Also, another myth I heard, from a number of people, and this has really changed over the last years, is people would say, well, you're not going to see real interesting cases in the private arena. That may have been true 50 some odd years ago, but now I would say equally interesting cases occur in both types of settings. And as I mentioned earlier, academics is not restricted to the university-based setting. So, just speaking of myths, when it comes to dangerous animals in Africa, oddly enough, believe it or not, it's not the lions and crocodiles that you need to be the most worried about. It's a herbivore, the hippopotamus, which is responsible for more deaths in Africa than either lions or crocodiles. And interesting enough, it's probably one of the few animals that actually could be said to murder its victims. It has no interest in eating you, but you need to be very careful approaching these animals. They're very they're agitated very easily. The tusks on a male hippo can reach up to 12 inches, and they can easily kill and do kill human beings. So to spell another myth, it's not animals that you always think are the most dangerous. It can be ones that you were not suspecting at all. Okay, let's first talk about university medical school employment. First of all, just understand there's been a lot of changes in the last 3 to 4 decades in this environment. Basically, if you decide to become employed by a university medical school, bear in mind that generally you don't have a contract. Usually your offer letter from the chair is your contract, and the hint I will give you is negotiate, as there are a lot of opportunities to do that. It's kind of expected in the academic environment that you will negotiate. More emphasis and recognition of the clinical expertise of the surgical and cytopathologist. I've really, to me, when I first started in the practice in 1995, it seemed like that the value of the clinical expertise I provided to the institution was not considered that worthy. But that has definitely changed, and I think for the most part, most people can enjoy quite a bit of recognition for their clinical skill set. If you're looking for stability, the academic environment is generally very stable. Yes, you can see reductions in income, reductions in staff, but certainly it is more stable than the private industry or even freestanding self-employed type private practices. But it is more fluid, and by that I mean people are more likely to leave the academic setting to pursue usually administrative roles in other academic institutions that may not be available from the institution in which they're originating. For example, for me, I moved from Wake Forest to University of North Carolina because I wanted the opportunity to be a director of surgical pathology, and that existed there, but it didn't exist for me at Wake Forest University. So you have to be aware of that. I think the downside of that is that I often have found over the years that I've made very good friends only to have them leave to go elsewhere. But it is sort of part of the nature of academic medicine. I think anyone who goes into the academic field must obtain satisfaction in providing or contributing to the medical environment, including teaching and literature. And again, this was a big motivating factor for me. I also like the fact that the university and academic-based environment is heterogeneous. It's a changing environment. It's fluid. Yes, your friends may leave for other institutions, but you have new residents who are coming in, new medical students to teach. So it's a constantly changing and evolving environment, which can be quite exciting and kind of maintain a lot of, and help maintain many people's interest throughout years of work in the academic setting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about salary. In the academic setting, for the most part, your salary is largely based on advancement. Generally, you don't have usually large increases in salary. It's usually a slightly more incremental, and there can be incentives for additional clinical work, but often there are not. That being said, the salaries are generally stable, as I've already alluded to earlier. So expect salary increases as you move from instructor to assistant professor to associate to full professor in terms of what you can expect. There are real benefits, of course, in being in here. I mentioned contributing to the medical literature, but their benefits can also be obtaining national recognition, being invited personally to meetings and lectures. But you have to remember, this takes time to develop. Usually this doesn't develop overnight. Tenure in some settings is still offered, but for people that are doing clinical track, generally doesn't occur anymore. Tenure is usually given with associate professor advancement at that level. probably has more importance for the English or history professor than it would for you as a medical doctor, simply because of the fact that tenure is supposed to provide you with some stability in terms of your job. It makes it very hard for the university to get rid of you, for lack of a better way of saying that. But in the medical profession, because we have so many options, particularly in the private industry, and in many cases better paying options, I'm not even sure that really should be something that matters unless your focus is really on the research arena. Now you have to, and what this next statement, basically is true of any setting in which you're employed. Remember that for the most part, you're going to have little to no control over administration. Finances, histology lab, or employees. You can impact it, but you're not personally hiring those, and you're not personally involved with bargaining for their salary in most cases. But the good news is you have the opportunity to basically concentrate on what you do best, and that is surgical pathology. Okay, what about private national lab employment? And the examples I would include here would be some of the larger labs, LabCorp, Quest, Aurora. There are many examples out there. What about this type of employment? Well, I've personally never been employed by this, but I have worked with administration at LabCorp. I have colleagues that have worked there, so I think I can provide some insight into this as well. First of all, as an employed physician, it has similarities to the university setting. It is stable. It's probably more stable than the freestanding private practice in the sense of your job security. But remember that this is a private industry, and pathology labs, for at least as far as venture capitalists are concerned, represent commodities, and you are definitely expendable. Now, we're all expendable to a large extent, but I think this is one of the things you realize in the private world. It's a little more obviously present than it is in the academic setting. These people are often salaried, very similar to what we see in academics, setting, but they do include some incentives in terms of jobs you may take on. This can include administrative responsibilities, generally have salary increases associated with them. While this may be true in the academic setting, I found that unless you're taking on major administrative roles, oftentimes there's no salary benefit to doing those roles. While in the private national lab employment industry, there often is at least some incentives. I would say that compared to most other job options, this option is more likely to be routine than other options. Some of these national labs employ people that just do GI pathology. If you like that's great. They will not provide you with any off-service time to pursue academic endeavors. So basically, you'll be doing GI pathology all the time. Just something to sort of be aware of. Now, in the private practice setting, this is kind of a heterogeneous way of looking at this, but remember, there's a wide range of practice settings. This can be a partnership track or an employed type setting. You can be in a democratic type of private practice where all the partners make the decision, and there can be more of a pyramid where you have one or two people at the top who basically decide on what is going to happen, or even what your salary may be. So quite a range of private practice models. In contrast to the academic setting, where you would receive a letter from the chair outlining your responsibilities, and that essentially represents the contract. In the private setting, you do often get an offer letter, and you get a contract. Sometimes it's an employment contract. In many cases, this employment contract may be very specific to you, or it may be a general employment contract that defines the benefits and parameters by which the entire collection of pathologists are employed. When I first went into private practice, I didn't know what I'm about to tell you, but and I've since seen certain things happen to people the hard way because they didn't know this. You can negotiate in the private practice setting, but my advice is be very careful with this, because the way most private practice people look at this is they're looking at it from a standpoint of, okay, I'm giving you the best offer available, and or they have parameters by which they can make that offer. For example, it may be, and we had this in our practice, where we had an offer that went to someone directly out of fellowship. We had an offer that went to someone with 2 to 3 years experience, and one offer that went to 3 to 4. And there was very little negotiation regarding that. So you could negotiate some things, maybe the time that you need to move and the start dates and so forth, but be wary of asking for significant increases in salary, or changes in the amount of years that you may make partner. Okay to discuss it. And if you know someone in the practice, you can discuss it, fine, but be wary about responding back with a formal letter. I will say it's not a bad idea to have the employment contract reviewed by an attorney. In some cases, this just helps you understand it better. Because you are a private practice, if you are in the setting where you are self-employed in a partnership track, you have potentially the most control of your situation. If you own the lab in particular, you can decide collectively, if that's the way the group is organized, on which immunohistochemical stains you bring in, which vendors you choose to do business with. So you have quite a bit of flexibility and quite a bit of control. Now that comes with a lot of responsibilities. That means that you also have liability on the hiring and firing practices of that group. And in some instances, if partners engage in activities that are, potentially unethical, or even hopefully not, but it can occur illegally, you may also be liable for what they do as well. So you have flexibility and control, but you arguably have the most potential of headaches with this type of practice. Salaries, we're going to talk about this in more detail, can be the best in the industry, but they do tend to fluctuate because, remember, you are a business generating income, generating billing, and basically how well you do, how much business you do can impact your salary. So more business can be a greater salary. Loss of business can be a reduction in salary, and therefore it's a much more fluid and less stable environment. If the partnership includes assets, for example, a lab, don't be surprised if you're asked to provide a buy-in. That buy-in can be whatever that group decides it can be. It may be logical in the sense that it may be a value of the assets of that lab. Remember that when you leave the group, you will have a buyout, so you'll get part of that back. Or it may be just an arbitrary number that the group has put together that says this is the equity and the hard work that we put into it, and this is what if you want to be a part of this, if you want to be a part of this partnership sharing, which can come with additional monies to your salary, then you need to buy in to that. But it generally buy-ins are related to assets. If the idea of a fluid environment regarding colleagues bothers you, then a private practice partnership can be more fulfilling, in the sense that if you're accepted in the group, the idea is that you're going to be there for life. So there's much more of a tendency of a private practice partnership to view you as a member of the family, and that can be good or bad. I mean, when you interview for a private practice versus when you interview for academics, one thing that's a little bit different is oftentimes in a private practice setting, how well the spouse gets along can become very important, because, again, if there's a small number of members, do they really want a troublesome spouse? In the academic arena, that doesn't matter at all. But in the private practice setting, that can be a very important thing to consider. Now, there also exist hybrid models, which is where I am now. These typically are physician-run group practices where, that employ physicians. An example is Cleveland Clinic. Another example could be Mayo Clinic. What do I like? These are academic settings that definitely pride themselves on having a higher expectation and value to your clinical expertise. And as a result of that, you have less time off to a certain extent to pursue activities, but you can expect your salaries to be generally higher than they would be in the traditional academic model. little less fluctuation in range than is expected in that model. But at the same time, basically I kind of view these between a traditional academic model and private and private practice. Not absolute, but I think it's a good guideline. In our model here at Cleveland Clinic, there's no tenure, and tenure is not relevant. In fact, you can apply for professorships, so to speak, through our neighboring Case Western University, but it has no relevance to your salary at all. So if you want to be assistant associate or full professor, you can look at the criteria and see if you would meet those criteria. So let's talk a little more specifically about salary, just to give you kind of an expectation. So this is a Medscape survey looking at pathology 2019, and it compares roughly annual compensation between various specialties. And you can see pathology tends to ride right in the middle of this. And of course, this particular salary you're seeing here is not necessarily what you should expect to make, because this includes salaries from people just starting out, the salaries of people that with 30 years experience, people that are in academics versus people that work at national labs versus people that are in the self-employed private practice setting. But it does give you a little bit of an idea of where average annual compensation is. And again, this is just to give you a little bit more detail of what that actually represented. Okay, now this is an older picture, 2016, but it illustrates a concept that I want to make here, and that is pathology compensation is also not equal across the United States, and to a certain extent it fluctuates based both on cost of living and supply and demand. Places that are much more popular are also less likely to compensate as good. Places that are less popular, may compensate better. It's been my experience that a lot of the central Midwestern United States is often some of the best places for higher salary, and it comes with a very low cost of living. Conversely, the coast, particularly the West Coast, relative cost of living tends to compensate, in my opinion, often relatively poorly. This doesn't mean that you should choose your location of work based on this. It's just something that you just need to be aware of. And of course, as I mentioned, pay very close to the cost of living. So what is the cost of living? So there are a variety of sites you can go on that will give you some idea of cost of living. This is an example of one, payscale.com, where if I'm comparing a salary of $250,000 in Cleveland, to somewhere else, I can go on the site to get a rough idea of where it actually stands. Remember that the cost of living, as we've already alluded to, is especially likely to fluctuate and probably the strongest correlates with the price of housing, and that supply and demand can play a role on whether you're actually compensated accordingly. And I'll give you an example. For example, in New York, to have the benefits in Cleveland of a $250,000 salary in New York, you need to make over $500,000 a year. That's largely related to the increased cost of living, particularly housing. Just, other examples, Denver, Colorado, slightly more. San Francisco, again, approaching that of New York. Chapel Hill, a little bit less. Omaha, Nebraska, even less. I mentioned the Midwest earlier. Honolulu, Hawaii, much more. So again, when you're considering places, and let's say you're a resident in a place with a relatively low cost of living, and someone's offered you this fantastic opportunity in New York making $350,000 a year, you need to, and someone else has offered you a job in Cleveland at $275,000. Remember that $275,000 salary is going to go a lot further in Cleveland. Again, that may or may not matter to you, but it's something you definitely should bear in mind. Another place that you can look is salary.com. Some older data, and we just sort of alluded to this. The cost of living in New York is about 82% higher, largely related to housing. Therefore, the same cost of living you need to earn $456,587. Okay. Now, unfortunately, it'd be nice if it were true that employers paid accordingly, but they typically don't. And some of these high demand areas mean that people will go there regardless. So On average, employers typically pay about 20% higher compared to Cleveland, meaning that your actual salary is likely to be more in this particular neighborhood. So don't expect necessarily where the employer to compensate you according to the cost of living. You may need to make some sacrifices if there are specific areas you want to live. Okay, and don't forget taxes. Another important point. There are many U.S. states that currently don't have an income tax, and this should be borne in mind. State income taxes are, take a fairly big chunk of your income. Obviously, some states make up for this in sales tax and property taxes, so you need to do a little bit of investigation. And believe it or not, there can also be city taxes that can take pinches out of your income. So it's always worthwhile to look into this a little bit more. And just into the specifics of each state, right? And this just gives you kind of a range, and this is a little bit older data, but this gives you kind of an idea of the top marginal rates. From Pennsylvania's 3.07% to California's 13.3%. So it's, and we're kind of in the middle in Ohio. Now, the salary that you get does vary depending on the practice setting that you're in. This was a 2017 CAP survey that showed basically some differences between the academic hospital setting, the non-academic hospital or medical center setting, and the independent laboratory. And as I've alluded to earlier, you can expect generally a higher salary and total compensation in the independent laboratory, particularly if it's owned by the physicians, than you would in an employed setting. And the private employed setting is generally, but not always, more than the academic or university-based setting. So let's talk about what do you do? And what do you do largely depends on what you want to do, but I have some general advice. First off, and this was some advice given to me by a very wise anatomic pathology director at the Medical College of Georgia named Dr. Rao, who told me at one point, and of course this is a little bit less likely today, but when I was approaching residencies in the 90s, there was a trend at a lot of academic centers to train people only on AP or CP tracks and not to do both the anatomic and clinical pathology. He advised me strongly against it. He said, Scott, you don't know what the future holds. Get solid training in AP, but make sure you do both AP and CP. And that was some of the most wise advice that I ever got, because of course I left the academic arena and went into private practice. And I can tell you, unless you're with a very large private practice that has the capacity to employ its own clinical pathologist, generally you're going to have roles in the clinical lab, right? I mean, if you got APCP boards, you may be the director of clinical chemistry, or you may be a director of a regional hospital lab, but you're going to be required to have both, and you're going to be expected to take call for both. So if there's nothing keeping you from doing it, I'd recommend getting both, even if you're going to do academics, okay? Of course, when I was coming along, pathology training was 5 years, but I think pretty much everybody advises somebody to do a fellowship. I can tell you in the private practice setting as well, we were not interested in someone just finishing a pathology residency, particularly because all of us have done 5 years, including a fellowship. So for the most part, don't even think about it. Do a fellowship. There are many specialties that you could pursue a fellowship in. Some of them have boards, some of them don't. Pursue your interest. Just realize that some of them may be more attractive, and there may be more job opportunities than others. And of course, I think you have to consider your family situation and consider the fact of whether you're restricted to certain parts of the country, that you need to be. Some of the things I'm telling you, you may be able to take advantage of, some of them not. But if your family's unhappy, you're going to be unhappy. So you have to bring your spouse or your significant other into that equation. And of course, whether they have their own good job or whether they're mobile or can work from home may also impact those decisions. Ask yourself, what do you really enjoy doing? What are the important things for you? Is national recognition and publications important for you? Do you enjoy a lot more time off? What do you like to do? I think these are very important things to ask. And, I always tell people, if you really don't know, you can't really go wrong with a university-based setting. For one, you'll get good training. You generally will be brought in a little bit more of a slower manner in terms of your sign out. You'll have experts around you that can work with you to sort of gradually bring you into feeling comfortable being your own pathologist. And the second important fact is that you will be more attractive for future employment or even partnerships. It's far easier for me if someone calls me and asks me what do I think about a certain pathologist. If I've only known them as a fellow, I can say all these good things about them, but I can't really say how they, were they effective? Were they, in signing out? What did, how was their accuracy rate at frozen section analysis? On the other hand, if they're a colleague, I can comment a lot more on how they practice as a pathologist, because in general, when people come out of fellowship or residency, you never really know what they're going to be like in the real practice setting. So you can't go wrong being employed in a university-based setting. And I always say this to people: no matter what you do, don't burn bridges. Even in situations that seem very unfair, be careful about this. You never know if the same employer you're leaving will be an employer that 5 years down the road you're going to be asking to come back. Okay, so suppose you decide on the university option. What are my recommendations on that? Well, if possible, try to find an academic job that at least affords you some time off service to pursue activities, like, for example, teaching or research, because that's really what's going to allow you to advance the most. And again, if you desire to obtain a national reputation, ask yourself, is the department I'm looking at stable? Is there a new chair? It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but sometimes chairs will be pushed out of an institution because of poor performance, unethical things that have occurred, maybe poor leadership. And so you will often see in these settings a large turnover of the pathologists themselves. Talk to people if you're interviewing there. Find out if they're content generally with the way they are. Physicians are generally fairly vocal about that kind of thing, so it shouldn't be difficult. Remember, we talked about this: negotiate for what you want. Your chair will generally have a range of salaries they can work with, maybe not extreme, but don't be afraid to ask. All they can say is no. You're not going to offend anybody in this particular setting. Also, think about the things that you need that will make you successful. Do you need some additional research funding? Do you need access to an immunohistochemistry lab? What is it that you're wanting that will make you successful? Don't ever be afraid to ask. As I mentioned earlier, your contract will usually consist of a letter from the chair outlining the specifics of your job. So make sure you're in agreement with that letter. And now that you've got the university job, what do I recommend that you do? Well, you may have already started this, but if you really are interested in academics and you know this early on, try to begin publishing during residency, trying to get some articles, get the experience of what it's like to publish. Best to pick a specialty interest. You can develop a national reputation quicker by developing, picking a specific subspecialty. While it might be tempting to publish in a variety of specialties and you may be given this opportunity, my recommendation is to focus, because it will give you more benefits later on. If you do a fellowship, find one with volume. Don't let the personality that set the fellowship or that individual person necessarily influence it. And it's not wrong to do a fellowship with a famous person. Just remember that famous person may leave. I've seen this happen where a pathology resident was headed to an institution because this famous pathologist was there, well known, many publications, internationally recognized, and right before that resident was leaving for her fellowship, that pathologist took a chair job elsewhere. If you choose the institution, for example, Mayo Clinic, would be a good example, place I did a fellowship. Yes, I had an interest in training with the individuals who were there, but whether they were there or not, I know I had good material and I would have a lot of volume to work with. I think this is so important. There are some geniuses out there that seem to be able to thrive without a mentor, but most of us who don't fall into that category, we need people that can help us navigate the academic waters, that can provide us with opportunities. I can now tell you where the controversial areas are in bone and soft tissue and whether there's something worth publishing. But when I was first starting out, I needed people like Dr. Chris Fletcher or Dr. Chris Uni or Tony Nascimento. I needed them to tell me where there were opportunities. I needed people to provide me with a chance to write a book chapter. No one was going to give it to me at early stage of my career. And mentors open doors for you. So find a mentor who can provide that opportunity for you. If your specialty has an international organization, join the organization, attend the meetings, get to know people involved, seek collaborations if it's possible. And, best advice I can give you, don't turn down opportunities to get your name out, whether that's talks at a national meeting, seemingly insignificant book chapters or whatnot. Collaborate, get your name out there, show you're a team player. And remember, if your goal is national recognition, write as much as possible. And don't consider any publication, whether it's in the American Journal of Surgical Pathology or Case Reports of Pathology, N=1 on your CV. Okay, so what if you decide on the private practice option? What are my recommendations there? Well, you need to do a little bit of preparation in here, and to some extent, I would say scrutinize it more than you would the academic endeavors. Ask yourself about the practice. Is it stable too? Has there been any turnover on the people that are there? If there's recent turnover, try to determine why. And very important, ask who makes the decision. If you're joining what seems like a partnership, it would be nice to know whether the partners make that decision collectively, whether each person has one vote, or is there one or two people who have the power in the group, the equity in the group, and they make all the decisions. Very important to know that. Ask about the practice reputation. What is the practice's reputation in the community? How do people view them? Do they view it as a good practice, an ethical practice? Again, less of an issue in the academic environment. I would not say it's not an issue, but very important in the private practice. And this next one depends on what you want. If it is a partnership, are you being offered partnership? Is that even an option? Is that even in your contract? This would be something I would ask about if it wasn't offered to me, would be if there was a partnership, I would ask, will that opportunity be given to me, or will I be employed? Oftentimes partnerships initially employ you as a pathologist and then offer you a chance to be partnered after several years. That may come with some sort of equity buy-in. Again, if there's an asset, you need to expect that. But it's important to know, is that an option? One thing that I think people early on fail to understand is that, when you talk about partnerships, and owning a lab and equity, as you move through that arena from an employee to potentially a partner, the idea sort of in the partnership is that you're going to have business coming in, and in addition to what may be a flat salary, you will be bonused or given dividends based on the income that came in. And in many cases, that is split equally. I've seen some differences in my life, but I would say put a lot more emphasis on voting equity. Because again, it's easy to focus on saying, oh, I'll be making this and I'm concerned that my salary is equal to yours. No, I'm very concerned that my voting equity is there. Do I get a vote or a say-so in it, and is it equal to the other partners in the group? So I put a lot of emphasis on that as being an important thing. Remember that your contract is going to be fairly complex. Have it reviewed by an attorney so that you can completely understand what it means for you. There will be things in there that could result in your, moving up to a partner, but there could also be things that relate to your expulsion from the group. Remember, negotiations can be tricky, so be careful. If you can find somebody that you've interviewed with who you trust, that you can talk a little bit about some of your concerns, I would tend to do that first before I send a formal letter. To me, a formal letter would be the wrong way to go in this situation unless everything's been discussed and you've been given a go-ahead to respond in that manner. Remember, that group is likely offering you something that all the other members have also done themselves. So by you asking for more, you stand a chance to offend potential members of that group. I know it shouldn't be that way in my mind, but I know for a fact it is often that way. And no matter what choice you make, just remember the following. A colleague of mine in private practice used to say this, that your colleagues care about ability, availability, and affability, and not that order. I would say to you that we tend to go into these practices thinking that the most important thing is that I'm a very competent pathologist. Yes, that is extremely important, but no one will care ultimately if you're not available and you're not a nice person, right? So if you are affable, so I would reverse that order and say, in life in general, remember that affability, availability, and ability are all important. Don't let ability just drive your thinking in terms of your value to a practice. People will always appreciate someone who it becomes aware of a problem and seeks to solve it, as opposed to just being a complainer. And again, life's not going to be fair. You are going to see people compensated sometimes better from you. Sometimes there'll be a valid reason, and sometimes there may not be that you can tell. But you just have to realize it isn't fair. Get over it. Seek to be someone who provides solutions and not just simply a complainer. And I think this is also an important thing that we always have to remind ourselves of. You don't have to like everyone you work with, but you do need to play fair with everybody that you work with. So I think fairness over likeness and being able to get along with people of all types of diversity and diversity of opinion is extremely important in any of these jobs that you choose. And with that, I thank you and good luck on your endeavors. And as I said before, the grass is brown on all sides, but it's also bright on both sides as well.